Alright, good morning everybody. This video will be going up on Tuesday, March 24th, and we are really starting a new unit here. So I'll walk you through what I would have had you done if we were in class to start this lesson, and I'll go through what the activities will be for today. The questions here ask, what information does this map provide, and in what region of the world did the United States intervene the most? So for the first one, it's pretty simple. If you look, the map has a title. It says U.S. Interventions between 1890 and 1920. In other words, all the places where the U.S. was getting involved around the world. Anywhere where you see a tiny little American flag is a place where the U.S. was taking action in some way. What should jump out at you is that the U.S. was pretty busy. For a long period of our history, Americans really focused on life in the United States, on things within our borders, but as we get towards the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, the U.S. starts to expand its kind of horizons and look to go beyond the reach of just North America. And that's part of this new unit. It also shows you who were the presidents during this time period. We've talked about Theodore Roosevelt. We're going to talk more about him today. In the middle here is a guy called William Howard Taft. Not much known about him. He's president during this time period as well. He follows Roosevelt. And after Taft comes Woodrow Wilson, who will be president during the First World War. 2 says, in what region of the world did the United States intervene the most? Well, take a quick look. Where do you see most of these tiny little American flags? You should be saying right around this part of the world. If you notice, there's a flag for Mexico, Puerto Rico, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti. These are all places where the U.S. was taking action. Now that part of the world, where everybody is Spanish speaking, for the most part, we call Latin America. So that'd be number 2. This new unit is all about imperialism and World War I. And this cartoon explains a lot about what we're going to talk or get into today. You see the giant eagle represents the United States, and it's got its wings spread. The caption says 10,000 miles from tip to tip. From the left wing to the right wing, the eagle is covering all the territory that's come under the control of the United States by the year 1898. We're going to find out how the U.S. comes to control Puerto Rico, if you're curious about that, what our relationship is with Cuba and why that's been such a tense, difficult relationship for such a long time. And in the cartoon, the eagle has his sights fixed on Manila. If you don't know, Manila is the capital of the Philippines. So we'll find out, how does the U.S. get involved in all of these places as far away as the Philippines in the Pacific off the coast of China and as near as Puerto Rico. But why are we involved in all these places, and how does it affect the relationship we have today? World War I we'll be getting to by the middle of this week. So this first standard here for the new unit says to explain America's evolving relationship with the world at the turn of the 20th century. So when it goes from 1800s into the 1900s. What we will hit today is something called the Spanish-American War, which most Americans know very little about. But it's a big part of how the U.S. becomes this world power that we are today. We'll explain how the Philippines are involved there and how some Americans debate the idea of expanding or being imperialistic and taking over other territories. I kind of mentioned our involvement in Latin America. We'll talk about Theodore Roosevelt a little bit more tomorrow. He is part of the story in the Spanish-American War, but I'll talk to you more about him tomorrow on something called the Roosevelt Corollary. It's an addition to the Monroe Doctrine, and what the story is in Panama and the building of the Panama Canal. So I'm going to give you some notes today. There is an activity and assignment to do about the Spanish-American War, but if you watch this and go through it with me, I'm going to give you the answers to that too. So I'll make that part easy on you. Really, the only part you'll have to do on your own will be a little visual analysis based on some things about the Spanish-American War, but I'll introduce all that to you. I'll also go over a few things when we get to the end of this. So attached, you should find a sheet that looks like this. Just fill in the blanks, and I'll go through what you need to know to help you do that. Before I do, this part you don't have to copy down. I would in class ask you to tell me what you see going on here What do these little guys represent? What do we think this cartoon means? First thing you should be seeing is all these little guys who are kind of pulling on this continent, all grabbing a piece of it. And it makes it very clear it's Africa. Each little person is going to represent a different European country. So here's Italy, here's Portugal, Spain, France, Belgium, Germany, Great Britain. They're all pulling on Africa. They want a piece of it. What does it mean? Well, it means that all these European countries were competing for control of African nations. That's why it's called the Mad Scramble for Africa. You might remember from world history that by the late 1800s, almost every country in Africa has come under the control of some European nation. There are only two exceptions, Ethiopia and Liberia. Those two were never colonized by European nations, but the rest of the continent was. And this had been going on for years and years. By the time we get to the late 1800s, the United States thinks, well, maybe we as a nation should get in on this action, that we should not allow Europeans to dominate the world, that we should jump into this ourselves. Now remember, the United States had always been expanding its borders, beginning as 13 colonies on the East Coast and eventually getting all the way west. The idea of manifest destiny motivated it. But once the U.S. had pretty much conquered all of North America, people started to look for colonies overseas. And this idea of becoming more imperialistic is something the Americans sought to do, extend their power economically, politically, or militarily over weaker nations. Now, there are three main factors that fuel or encourage American imperialism. One is that the U.S. wanted to become a more dominant military power. People believed, Americans believed, if we want to protect our trade and our business interests, we have to have the military muscle to back that up. So by 1890, building up our battleships, the U.S. had become the third largest naval power in the world. The other factor that encourages imperialism is this idea that we need new markets. Not places to buy fruit and vegetables. We're talking about countries, more people to trade with. We as a nation, remember, had become the biggest industrial power. We produced way more than we could consume. So we wanted to find other trading partners to sell all the things we were making to. If we also found new places to sell our goods to, we'd have other places where we could bring in raw materials from. So new markets, places to sell our goods, and also take raw materials from. And I think this cartoon kind of sums it up. You'll see Uncle Sam, we'll talk about him a lot today. He's featured in many of these cartoons that talk about U.S. imperialism. But here he is, he's got his arm around all these territories that will become American possessions. The Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii. And many people push for what's called annexation, adding those territories, making them part of the United States. Just like I talked about earlier, the U.S. is looking for new markets to sell its goods. So one of the things that really motivated Americans was, hey, let's get access to places where we can sell all the things we're making. One of the places that really Americans were interested in being able to trade with was China. This idea that there are millions and millions of people there, it's such a massive country, it'd be a great place for us to sell our things to. The funny thing is, China ends up exporting way more to America than we ever export to China. But at the time, this was one of the beliefs that fueled imperialism in the United States. The last factor was this belief Americans had, white Americans, that they were culturally superior. Remember, manifest destiny, people thought that they were chosen by God to spread their, what they thought was better way of life to all the people that, Native Americans that lived in Western territories. Well, now this goes beyond America's borders. And many people, English people felt this way as well, but white Americans thought they had this superior civilization, technology, their Christian faith, that somehow it was their duty. It was referred to as the white man's burden at times, to spread all of these things to the world's inferior peoples. In the cartoon, if you look, people from Cuba and Hawaii and Puerto Rico are drawn as ape-like, less than human, and this is how some people felt, that Uncle Sam had this duty to uplift these people. Now, we know this is nonsense today, but it was a factor that fueled imperialism at the time. It's a racist mentality that many white Americans had. Okay, I'm going to give you the story about how the U.S. comes to acquire Alaska and Hawaii before we talk about this Spanish-American War. The story in Alaska is very simple. In 1867, the Secretary of State William Seward bought it. It was territory that belonged to Russia. He makes a deal for the purchase for $7.2 million. So this is not very long after the Civil War ended. When he did this, many people thought he was foolish. They said, you've purchased this land that's worthless. They called it Seward's Icebox or Seward's Folly. But the truth is, Alaska is important for its fishing. It is rich in timber. It has minerals and oil. And it's a massive amount of territory. It is by far the biggest state in the United States. We got all that land for 2 cents an acre. So he had the last laugh there. Now, although the U.S. takes possession of Alaska in 1867, it won't become a state officially until 1959. Now, the story in Hawaii is a little bit more complicated. Hawaii, if you were to look at the globe, is a good spot if you're leaving from the west coast of America to stop on your way to Asia, about halfway in between. So it was economically important to the U.S. as far back as the 1790s. Merchants, people who were traders, would stop there on their way to China, India to refuel. By the mid-1800s, many American businessmen had invested money in growing sugar there. It is a tropical place. It's a great place to grow sugar. They also believed it would be a good spot for a military base, because if something ever went on or there was a conflict in Asia, it'd be a good spot for the U.S. to have ships, to have its military, so it could quickly get to those locations. For a long time, the U.S. had deals worked out where it could import sugar from Hawaii tax-free. Then there was this idea to place a tariff on Hawaiian sugar, and it would raise the price of it. Remember, a tariff is a tax on imports. So many of these American businessmen said, well, why don't we just add Hawaii? Let's just make it part of the United States. That way we can avoid this whole tariff. So they want to annex Hawaii, have it join the U.S. In 1891, this woman here in the picture, her name is Queen Liliuokalani, she takes over in Hawaii. She's the rightful ruler. And she wants to get rid of all these foreigners who have so much control over her country. She says we should have Hawaii for Hawaiians. She wants to get rid of certain voting qualifications. She believes everybody should be allowed to vote, not just landholders. Now, wealthy people and American business leaders don't like this, so they look for a way to get rid of her. They organize a revolt, a rebellion, to kick this queen out. Now, she's the rightful ruler, remember, but with the support of U.S. Marines, these wealthy businessmen force her out. She's exiled. They take control of the island. They set up a temporary government and appoint a man named Sanford B. Dole as president. You might recognize that name, Dole. There's a famous Dole fruit company that still produces all kinds of fruit cups and pineapples and bananas. This person was a relative of that later Dole fruit company president, which shouldn't surprise you. This is American business interests really winning out. The president at the time was Grover Cleveland when this happened. He thought it was wrong that we had forced the Hawaiian queen out. He issued an apology, and he said the U.S. should not take over Hawaii unless the Hawaiian people want it. Unless they want to be annexed, that shouldn't happen. Years later, when McKinley is president, he supports the idea of annexing Hawaii, and it becomes a U.S. territory in 1898. Similar to Alaska, Hawaii becomes an American possession, but it won't officially become a state until 1959. Now, I want to point out this cartoon here. Many students have told me in the past on the end of course exam, there are cartoons like this one. You see Uncle Sam, and the caption says Uncle Sam catches the ripe fruit. So he's got his hat out, and he's looking to catch all these pieces of fruit. But each piece of fruit represents a different territory that the U.S. might want to take on. So if you see a cartoon like this, you know it's about American imperialism, about territories the U.S. is looking to acquire. Alright, so that's the story in Hawaii, and we talked about Alaska. I'm going to include the link so you can read this section of the book about the Spanish-American War, but I'm going to go through all the questions with you too. If you look after the notes page, you're going to see this sheet, and I put a link actually in the document itself so you can access the textbook. But I'm going to go over all these things with you too. Okay? The first section says read about the Spanish-American War, write notes in the appropriate boxes, answer the questions about its causes and effects. Okay, so for 1 through 6, these are all reasons why the Spanish-American War happened. So it's a war between Spain and the U.S. How do all these things, or all these events, push us towards a war with Spain? I'm going to go through each one with you, and I'll talk about the other parts too. So the first thing is American business interests. Well, businessmen had been investing in Cuba, again another place where you could grow sugar, like Hawaii, for years and years. So they had a vested interest in what was going on there. The Cuban people, remember, for years and years, 400 years, were controlled by Spain. Anywhere where people speak Spanish at one time, that was a Spanish colony. American businesses are invested there. They're worried if Cuban people rebel or are fighting with Spain, that could jeopardize their investments, especially in these sugarcane plantations. So that's part of why this might push the U.S. toward war. These businessmen are saying the U.S. should get involved to protect their money. Jose Marti is another reason why the U.S. wants to get involved. Jose Marti is a Cuban journalist, a writer, and he was kicked out of Cuba for trying to lead a rebellion against Spain. He's going to help organize Cuban resistance and launch a new revolution in 1895. But he's going to do things specifically to try and pull the U.S. into this conflict. He was smart. He had his people deliberately attack American businesses, sugar mills, sugar fields and mills. These plantations where Americans had millions and millions of dollars invested. He figured if I put these things in jeopardy, it will pull the U.S. into this conflict, and the U.S. will be encouraged to help the Cubans fight for independence. He wants the U.S. to help achieve a Cuba Libre, a free Cuba. Valeriano Weyler is a Spanish general who's sent to put down the rebellion in Cuba. But he's extremely brutal in the way that he does it. And this is how he's being characterized in the cartoon, that he's this bloodthirsty ape. So because he takes such harsh action against the Cuban people and forces them into these internment camps where people die, and there are all these horrible rumors about this vicious treatment, it's another thing that's making Americans have sympathy for the Cubans. And makes them tell their government leaders, hey, we ought to get involved here to help the Cuban people achieve their freedom. Something else that pushes Americans toward war is what's called yellow journalism. At the time, there were these really exaggerated stories that were coming out of the news. Often, they were only partially true or completely made up. Newspapers were really doing things to just try and get people to buy them. So you probably think about when you walk out of the grocery store, those crazy headlines you see in the National Enquirer or something like that, where you know those stories aren't true, but they're just trying to get your attention to get you to buy that magazine. That was very common at the time. It was called yellow journalism. And they would really exaggerate the brutality of what was going on and exaggerate all the horrible things that Spain was doing to Cuba. And it's another thing that encourages Americans to sympathize with Cuban rebels and say, we ought to join this war. Remember, Americans also identified with the idea of being controlled by a colonial power. You know, some said, okay, the U.S. fought for freedom from the British, and this is a similar fight. Cubans ought to be allowed to gain their freedom from the Spanish. The last few things here would be the Delome letter and the explosion of the USS Maine. The Delome letter, it was a message from a foreign minister or representative to Spain. And the message that was being sent included some insults about the American president. It said that he was only out for the adulation of the crowd. It was an insult towards President McKinley. And not that that's the best reason to go to war, but it was just one of many things that turned people against the Spanish. They were already angry about what was happening. Now to hear this person who represents Spain insulting the American president increases these anti-Spanish feelings. Because Americans are worried about what's happening in Cuba, President McKinley sends this ship. It's called the USS Maine. It's stationed off the coast of Havana, capital of Cuba. to protect any Americans that might be there and interests that we have there. Well, on the night of February 15th, 1898, it blows up and 260 Americans are killed. So right away, people are saying, remember the Maine, to war with Spain. Now, I want to stop and get into, and the U.S. declares war shortly after that. But before I continue on with this, I want to stop and get into what caused the explosion of the USS Maine. And this is not part of the activity, but I think it's worth getting into. Sometimes it depends on who you ask. If you read the book, you're going to get the best account that Americans have of it, that historians have of it, but it's from our perspective still. It's from the United States perspective. If you were to read other books, textbooks from Cuba, from Spain, from the Philippines, they might have different versions of the story. So I want to take a minute to talk about perspective here. This is a quote from a Spanish textbook talking about why did this ship explode. Now I highlighted kind of in bold here what they say. They say the cause of the explosion was never clearly explained, and North American authorities, the American government, attributed it or blamed it on the Spanish. They said it was Spanish sabotage. But the Spanish say, hey, we didn't do that. We weren't trying to pull the U.S. into this war. We had no reason to attack their ship. They're saying there's no explanation. Americans blamed it on Spain, but didn't have proof. What about the Philippines? We're going to talk more about how they're involved in this war. If you didn't know, the Philippines were also under the control of Spain at this time. Here's what the Philippines say. Although the Maine had been blown up by American spies in order to provoke or start the war, the public was not informed of the truth. So if you talk to people in the Philippines, they say Americans blew up their own ship so they would have an excuse to go to war with Spain and later take the territories they wanted all along. Now, the Filipinos have good reason to suspect the Americans were not being totally truthful or had ulterior motives, and I'll get to that later on. What about the Cuban books? The Cubans say, well, Americans were fearing that Cuba would obtain its independence and slip through its fingers. The U.S. needed an incident like that of the Maine. Consequently, everything points to a self-provocation. What they're saying is, Americans blew the ship up themselves. And they have evidence they believe to back it up. The theory concerning U.S. responsibility was reinforced by the fact that almost all white officials escaped the catastrophe because they were not on deck at the time of the blast. So, interesting, the Filipinos and the Cubans agree. They both believe the United States blew up its own ship so it would have an excuse to go to war and claim the territories it was really after. There's one more version. This is a textbook that comes from the Caribbean, so from several different islands in that area. What they say is, the ship had been blown up by an underwater bomb. Americans immediately blamed the Spanish, but in fact, the bomb was probably placed by Cuban patriots, these Cuban rebels, who saw the disaster as a way of bringing the United States into the war on their side. So now we have 4 different books and 3 different versions of it. The Caribbean book says, we think the Cuban people did this on purpose, so they could pull the U.S. into the war, just like Jose Marti believed, and help themselves get rid of the Spanish. Now, which one's the truth? Well, that's hard to say. The United States, at the time, blamed it on Spain, said it was a Spanish mine. Later investigations show that there was probably some kind of accident within the ship, and that nobody really attacked it, and it was some kind of internal error that just exploded. That, to me, makes more sense. But I do think it's interesting to look at different perspectives and to always question that, not always just accept the version that your country tells you. Alright, question 7 said, what happened during the war in the Philippines? Well, why are the Philippines involved at all? Like I said before, the Philippines was also Spanish territory at that time, and the people there were fighting for their freedom as well. One of the things that made Filipinos suspect the U.S. had ulterior motives is that when this war began, the first place the U.S. attacked was the Philippines. So maybe we had a plan in place here even before the ship exploded. A man named Commodore George Dewey was the one that led Americans in the Philippines. They destroyed the Spanish Navy in Manila. They were joined by this Filipino rebel, a leader named Emilio Aguinaldo. And The Filipino rebels, along with the Americans, forced the Spanish to surrender there. Theodore Roosevelt, we've talked about as a progressive president, but this is going back in time to before he was president. This is 1898. He didn't become president until 1901. 8 says, how did Roosevelt and the Rough Riders help lead the Americans to victory in Cuba? Well, Roosevelt seized this opportunity to make himself, or to try to make himself, a national hero. He wanted to raise his profile. So Roosevelt got a volunteer group of kind of tough guys. That's why they're called Rough Riders. Cowboys, college athletes, people that were looking to be heroes. And he headed down to Cuba between June and July of 1898. The Rough Riders, Theodore Roosevelt, and several African-American regiments are fighting in Cuba. There's a famous battle at a place called San Juan Hill that really makes Roosevelt a national hero. After that, the U.S. Navy is going to blockade Cuba, surround it with ships, destroy the Spanish fleet there. Next, they'll invade and easily take over Puerto Rico in July. So this war really is a big mismatch. The U.S. badly is far superior to Spain, and it's a 3 to 4 month war, sometimes referred to as a splendid little war by certain Americans. And Spain really didn't have much of a chance. At the end of it, it says, what happens to each of the following territories as a result of the Spanish-American War? Well, here we go. For 9 through 11, it's pretty simple. The U.S. and Spain will sign a treaty called the Treaty of Paris in December of 1898. It says that Cuba will become a free, independent country. Now, I'll touch more on this tomorrow about Cuba and how it's supposed to be free, but it's not completely independent, that the U.S. maintains some control there. It becomes what we call a protectorate, but I'll get into that more tomorrow. The islands of Guam and Puerto Rico become U.S. territory. So Guam is a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean. Puerto Rico, you guys know, in the West Indies we call the Caribbean today. Puerto Rico still is U.S. territory. Guam still is U.S. territory. Neither one is a state, but they are both places under U.S. control. If you're born in Puerto Rico, you are a U.S. citizen, but it is not an official state in America. The Philippines is slightly different. The U.S. does take over and compensates Spain, pays $20 million. But that's going to be a big problem because the people in the Philippines were not interested in being taken over by the U.S., and they will turn around and start a rebellion against the Americans the same way they had been rebelling against Spain when we intervened and got involved. The cartoon here features Uncle Sam once again. He's looking at the menu, the bill of fare, and saying, I hardly know which to take first. If you look, the waiter is supposed to be President McKinley, who was in office at the time of the Spanish-American War. Like, he's the one serving up all these territories to the United States. And Uncle Sam is looking at his choices: the Cuba steak, the Puerto Rico pig, the Philippine floating islands, or the Sandwich Islands. Hawaii used to be known as the Sandwich Islands. So this is kind of pointing out the U.S. is hungry for territory. This motivation for us becoming more imperialistic. Similar to the cartoon we started with, you have an eagle here and tiny flags where the U.S. has planted. The U.S. is looking to take over. Panama we'll get to later on. But we will see in cartoons how people feel about taking over territory in the Caribbean and the Philippines. Not everybody agrees on this. So I'm going to ask you to, the second activity is to look at these different visuals. There are 4 different pictures. One is a newspaper, and then the other 3 are political cartoons. But they're all primary sources. They all come from 1898, right at the time of the Spanish-American War. I'm going to ask you to look at those pictures. There's some information that goes with them, and then use that to answer all the questions on the second handout. This is what the second handout looks like. So you look at the visual. I included details along with it too, but you're going to look at the big version, and there are readings that go with them that will help you. But you can put your answers in right there. Okay? I'm not going to give you the information here, the answers to the questions, but I'll go through each one so you can look at it here. This is the first visual. This is visual A, and this is the one that asks, according to the headline, what caused the main explosion? That should be pretty obvious to you. Who is being blamed for it? And if you saw this newspaper, how would you feel towards Spain? Here's another example of a newspaper from the same time period, February 17th, 1898. And you might get some different details from this one. Alright, visual B. The caption says the Spanish brute adds mutilation to murder. 1. Who does the beast holding the knife represent? That should be obvious to you. 2. Why do you think he's drawn this way? 3. What's he standing on? And 4. What do you think was the purpose of this cartoon? Visual C. How some apprehensive or nervous people picture Uncle Sam after the war. Again, a primary source from the Detroit News in 1898. First question is, who does the man in the middle represent? You should recognize him. 2, who do the babies represent? That should be obvious to you. They're labeled. And 3, what is this artist's attitude toward the United States' newly acquired territories? The person who drew this cartoon, what does that person think about all these territories that the U.S. has taken over? The last one's my favorite one. The caption is, declined with thanks. 1 says, who is the man being fitted for a new suit? This man right here, who is he? Something unusual about him in this one, and that should tip you off. There's a reason why he's drawn this way. 2 says, what do the stripes on his pants represent? They're labeled. Read what it says. What does it represent? 3, who are the men entering the room? That's these people over here. 4, what do they have in their hands? What's in this bottle? Look carefully. 5, what's the meaning of the caption? So the guys entering the room, they're speaking here. They say, here, take a dose of this anti-fat and get thin again. And Uncle Sam is speaking, no, Sonny, I never did like any of that stuff, and I'm too old to begin. I'm going to try not to give it away. Figure those things out for yourself. I like this cartoon. There are other things that are hidden in here. On the door it says McKinley and Company National Tailors. Remember, William McKinley was the president during the time of the Spanish-American War, and that's actually supposed to be him. You can see his initials down here. He's the tailor fitting Uncle Sam for a new suit, probably because he was supportive of this idea that the United States should expand. The materials back here say enlightened foreign policy and rational expansion. There are other cartoons that make similar points that talk about America, starting off as a young nation, just a little baby here back in 1783, growing up by 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase, by 1819 adding places like Florida, we become kind of a young man. By 1861 at the end of the Civil War, we're older. 1898 after the Spanish-American War, we've added more territory, and by 1899 here we are, this massive nation that everybody wants to have a relationship with. It says a lesson for the anti-expansionists, the people that are against this idea of imperialism. It's showing how Uncle Sam has been an expansionist first, last, and all the time. Okay, quick reminders. The Unit 5 study guide, remember, is worth 50 points. Make sure you're completing and submitting that. And then I put a deadline on the Unit 5 test for Monday night. I will extend that to make sure that everybody gets a chance to complete those questions. Remember, it's essentially an open notes test, so everybody should do really well on the multiple choice part. The study guide is another 50 points. I'll add those together for a 100-point test grade. This week, tomorrow, or you'll be hearing this on Tuesday, so Wednesday, I'll wrap up what you need to know about U.S. imperialism and Panama Canal, and then later in the week we'll get into lessons about World War I. All right? Remember, if you have any questions, send me a message. The people that are doing that, I'm trying my best to get back to you quickly. I hope everybody's doing well and not going too crazy, but reach out to me if you need help with anything. Okay? Take care.